pessoal.
Yay! Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Camila Valenzuela Mogillansky, and it's a great joy to welcome you all to the series of seminars, Technologies of Presence in Times of Absence. We are very happy with the great reception that this seminar has had, far surpassing our expectations, which somehow confirms the relevance that the proposed topic has for many. First of all, I would like to thank the great organizing team that made this event possible: Emerita, Esteban, Lilian, Ivan Nilsson, Tatiana, and Rafael. Additionally, special thanks to André Ficker for his contribution through simultaneous translation, Marcelo Gontillo for his work creating the graphics for this event, and of course to the Universidade Federal de São Paulo, the Núcleo de Pesquisa em Saúde e Uso de Substâncias, the CAPES-Print, and Amata Escola de Fenomenologia Corporal for their support. Before delving into the subject matter, I'm going to refer to logistical aspects. So first of all, we have simultaneous translation for the Zoom room. In the chat, you can find the instructions to access for it. So I will repeat that in Portuguese now. Temos tradução simultânea para português na sala do Zoom. Para acessá-la, no canto inferior direito da sua tela, você pode encontrar um ícone que fala interpretação. Aí você pode clicar em português e já vai escutar a tradução do André. Essas instruções também estão postadas no chat. E se tiver algum problema, pode perguntar a alguns dos membros da equipe. Okay, so in relation to the Q&A, the discussion, given the large audience participating in the seminar, both in the Zoom room and on the YouTube channel, to ensure a more efficient and inclusive Q&A session, we kindly ask you to use the form link we'll provide in the chat to submit your questions during the presentation. So please don't write them directly in the chat because we might lose them because we're so many. So please use the form that we provide in the chat. It might not be possible to address every question submitted due to time constraints, so our team will select a representative sample for discussion. And then in the Q&A, questions will be organized into sets, usually 2 or 3 rounds, depending on the time we have. And if you have any question regarding this or other logistic issues, please contact our organizing team, which you can identify by the word team or equipe in the name. Okay. So now let's turn our attention to the purpose of this seminar series. In a time where we face several global challenges, such as an unprecedented climate and environmental crisis, wars, humanitarian crisis, and political turmoil, we find it imperative to reflect on the potential of technologies of presence in addressing these challenges. The term technology often brings up images of computational and digital advancements, including digital devices, virtual spaces, and artificial intelligence that have permeated different domains of our life. While beneficial in many ways, this development often falls short in addressing the pressing issues we face. Instead, they often exacerbate these challenges, such as worsening the climate crisis, impacting mental health, and increasing political polarization. Recognizing that the destructive or constructive potential of such technological development does not depend on the technology itself, but on how we use it, we aim to emphasize that certain human practices enabling us to develop profound understanding and management of our bodies and minds constitute technologies in their own right. These practices reshape our relationship with our environment, including technological artifacts, as well as with others and ourselves. With this understanding, we define technologies of presence as the set of practices and knowledge that deepen our engagement with our own experience. More specifically, in this seminar, the notion of technologies of presence includes ancestral methods of interacting with our environment and body, psychophysical training associated with artistic practices and somatic approaches, meditation and movement practices, therapeutic techniques enhancing sensory perception, and research methodologies centered on lived experience. So the aim of these seminars is to provide a platform for interdisciplinary reflection on these technologies of presence. Some questions that serve as access for this reflection are: what does presence imply in attentional, experiential, social, and even physiological terms? What are the characteristics of the practices that cultivate it? What does these practices teach us in relation to alternative modes of knowledge generation? And finally, what is the relevance of technologies of presence in contemporary times? We are honored to inaugurate these seminars with the presence of Professor Tim Ingold, whose extensive work on technique, technologies, and skills, coupled with a sensitive experiential approach, profoundly informs our understanding of human, non-human animals, and environmental interactions. Professor Tim Ingold is Emeritus Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. He has carried out fieldwork among the Sami and Finnish peoples of Lapland and has written on environment, technology, and social organization in the circumpolar north, on animals in human society, and on human ecology and evolutionary theory. His most recent work explores environmental perception and skill practice. His current interests focus on the interface between anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture. Thank you all for your presence and participation. Professor Ingold, we are deeply grateful for you have accepted our invitation. And without further delay, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Camilla, and thank you all for coming along. My title then is Digitization and Fingerwork. Picture a scientist, or a technician, or a stockbroker, or a business analyst at work. Seated at his desk, he stares at a screen, apparently mesmerized by the streams of numbers that flash before his eyes. At the same time, his fingertips dance over a keyboard. I'm interested in the relation between numbers and fingers. It's a relation that most of us absorbed in infancy when we first learned to count, reciting the numbers from 1 to 10 on the fingers of 2 hands. In this elementary exercise, fingers and numbers are as closely bound as hand to mind. And just give me a moment, I'm going to share the screen and get some pictures going, just a moment. So slideshow from beginning there. So what you see there is a picture from a Roman counting manual showing how to count. If you're if you're an ancient Roman, how you would count on your fingers, because fingers and numbers are closely bound, and it's why we use the same word digit, derived from the Latin for finger, digitus, for both. And yet for the business analyst of our example, the numbers flashing on the monitor seem radically detached from the hand and its operations. Does this mean that the bond between numbers and fingers has been broken? Well, in one sense, perhaps it has, as I shall endeavour to show. But in another sense, it has not. What has happened rather is that the finger itself, having contracted to the tip, has become equally detached from the hand. Where once the fingertip had been the place from which a probing hand initially feels the surfaces of the things with which it comes into contact, it is now the instrumental extension of a disembodied intellect operating under remote control from the brain. So in this sense, both numbers and fingers have suffered the same fate, thanks to their having been enrolled in the same process. And this is the process of digitization. So let's start, as we did in childhood, with fingers and numbers united in hand and mind. Here, every finger is a number precisely because it is conjoined with the others. On the hand, the fingers are joined not by external attachment, as for example on a robotic arm, but internally through a complex assembly of bone, muscle, and ligament. Our earliest experience tells us that this sense of being joined from the inside, like the fingers of one hand, is integral to what a number is. Indeed, the word for number in classical Greek, arithmos, is one of a large family of words derived from the root ar, A-R, and is cognate with ararisko, to join, as well as harmonia, harmony. A harmonious join in Greek thought is not of objects that butt up against one another on the outside, but rather of materials that rub along together, participating in each other's formation and holding tight through the counterbalanced forces of tension and friction. Such are the threads on the weaver's loom or the fibers of a twisted rope. Arithmos, then, is a number of strands bundled together, and arithmetic is about weaving and winding. For the Greeks, without the join, the very idea of number would have been inconceivable. As the philosopher Henri Bergson would put it some 2 millennia later, number is the synthesis of the one and the many, or, in a word, a multiplicity. And as such, it is essentially qualitative, characterized by the materials, or with the hand, the fingers, that make it up. In the history of Western mathematics, however, this idea of arithmos has gradually taken second place to a more abstract concept of number, divorced from materials in their gathering, and specified within a framework of formal logic. Indeed, it is more usual these days to encounter numbers as not qualitative, but quantitative multiplicities, made up of discrete or commensurable parts or units. We consequently come to associate arithmetic not with joining from the inside, but with adding up from the outside, along with cognate operations like subtraction, multiplication, and division. Here, it is the numbers themselves that are being operated upon, regardless of what they are numbers of. The child learns that 2 apples and 2 pears add up not to a bowl of fruit, but to the number 4. She comes to understand that the true meaning of number has nothing to do with the ways things are intrinsically joined in the real world, but only with their measurement according to common scales of value, whether metric or monetary. The numbers she learns to deal with, if they have any empirical referent at all, have been derived through some process of extraction, falling out as a kind of precipitate from the real world processes for which they serve as indices. And this precipitate is commonly known as data. And it is as data that numbers eventually fetch up on the screen of the analyst. He might call his activity data handling. And yet in this operation, his fingers are as distant from the world beyond the keyboard as are the numbers he manipulates. Now, literally, of course, a datum is a thing given, an offering. It comes from the Latin dare, to give. To receive the gift is to take it in your hands. So the real datum handlers in this sense would have been people who worked with cords, weavers, basket makers, musicians. They could have been ancient Inca people of what is now the Peruvian Andes, who would read numbers from their quipus, constructed on the same principle as the suspension bridge, likewise made from twisted fiber cords. As the anthropologist Gary Urton has shown, both the significance of numbers and the practices of arithmetic among Quechua-speaking peoples in the Andes, descendants of the Incas, are part of their attempt to maintain balance, harmony, and equilibrium in every sphere of communal life. And this picture here is called Keepers of the Quipu. It's a depiction from the early 17th century. You can see the man holding the quipu that he's looking after with its many cords. And in the corner, you can see a calculating device which uses stones to count. So there's an equivalence there between the cord way of counting and the stone way of counting. But weaving a tapestry or making a basket or playing a stringed instrument is just as much a practice of datum handling in the literal sense as is reading chords. Picking up and threading through, the weaver or player receives with her hands what the evolving work offers as it proceeds. And she counts as she goes, over and under, over and under. But her numbers don't add up. They rather follow on, marking in their recurrence the evolving rhythms of time passing. The rendering of the datum in its plural form as data is largely a modern development and marks the shift from qualitative to quantitative multiplicity. The datum is a real material thing of a certain form. But in the modern concept of data, information and matter have been split apart. Let me dwell a little further on what fingers can do. Their versatility is truly extraordinary, and for much of the time goes unnoticed. This morning, thinking about what to say in this lecture, I began to pay some attention to my own finger work. It included such operations as shaving, doing up the buttons on my shirt, unlocking the front door, thumbing the pages of the newspaper, opening a milk bottle, balancing a spoon laden with milk and cereal in bringing it to my mouth while eating breakfast, holding a mug full of hot tea by the handle, and now, as I write, holding a pen. Every one of these operations involves precise micro gestures, deploying the fingers in different ways and in different combinations. What is the hand, if not a compendium of gestures, particular to the manifold tasks in which it is brought into use? To pick up any implement, be it razor, key, spoon, mug, or pen, is to select from the compendium the gesture appropriate to its use. Now, every one of these gestures, of course, I have had to learn, many of them in infancy or early childhood, by both observing what others are doing and experimenting in my own practice under their guidance, until I get the feel of things for myself. If hands make gestures, gestures also make hands. And as in a relay, manual skills are passed on in the very process of generations living alongside one another in their overlap. This is what it means, in the strict sense, to carry on a tradition. For example, when I retrieve my pen to write, I pick up lines from the past and carry them on in gestures that have traveled from hand to hand through a process involving both imitation and emulation over countless generations. The same could be said of many other manual skills involving concerted fingerwork. People have been stitching and sewing materials for many millennia. The line here is a thread rather than a trace. Nevertheless, to stitch and sew is to pick up and carry on from where our predecessors left off. And the gestures involved, critically including the precision grip between thumb and forefinger, of which the human hand is uniquely capable. The gestures involved, although learned afresh in each generation, have changed little. Another example is baking bread. Prior to baking leavened bread, the dough needs to be kneaded. Fingers get to work on the sticky mass of glutinous material, working it into a paste. It's a skill that has been passed on without interruption for at least 8,000 years. But common to all these practices, handwriting, sewing, bread making, is a feeling for materials. In any operation calling for skilled finger work, attention converges on the contact zone where surfaces meet. And this picture here I like very much. It comes from a book, a treatise written by the engineer Frans Riolio in 1876, a Belgian engineer, called The Kinematics of Machinery. And it's a diagram showing the operator of a treadle grindstone at work. And I want you to focus on the not on the mechanics of the operating of the grindstone, which is mostly Riolio as he's concerned, but what he's doing with his hands. And you need to notice how he's delicately holding the hand, the workpiece over the grindstone, with his eyes focusing directly on that point of contact. So there is a real feeling for materials in that picture through the eye and the hands. And you see how the man's attention is focused on that contact point where the workpiece, whatever it is that he's dealing with, meets the surface of the grindstone. It's true that in many cases, this contact might be mediated by a handheld implement. So the carpenter feels the wood with the chisel, the writer feels the paper or parchment with the pen. But nevertheless, the sense of contact is so immediate that it allows the practitioner to respond with precision and judgment to the nuances of the material in every moment of their variation. What we call dexterity lies in this, in the capacity to vary one's gestures in continuous response to a feeling for the material as the task unfolds. It is the hallmark of skill. I shall use the term hapticality to refer to this sensory contact of practitioner and materials. Skilled fingerwork thus goes on in the meeting of surfaces in the zone of hapticality. That's in that area just here in Riolio's diagram. And crucially, haptic perception is not limited to the sense of touch. There can also be haptic vision and haptic hearing. Whatever the sensory register or registers involved, this is a modality of perception that is close up, even myopic, in which attention joins in harmony with the unfolding task, as if from the inside. It's what the instructor means when he tells the novice to watch closely or to listen closely, and of course to feel. If fingers are enablers of haptic perception, it is because of the singular capacity of the fingered hand to hold things close. With fingers bent to form a hook, this hand can not only hold, but also carry. It allows us to join our lives with the things we care for, to go along with them, responding to them as we go. Or in a word, it makes it possible for us to correspond with things. And not only things, but persons too. I mean, nothing better epitomizes the closeness and intimacy of a bond between persons, between lovers, between parent and child, between teacher and pupil, than the simple act of holding hands. And it is the fingers that make it possible for humans to do so. Oh, for some reason this has got, oops. Okay. Holding hands, usually palm to palm, and with fingers bent to form a hook, but sometimes even with the fingers intertwined, does not symbolize a togetherness that is attained by other means. Rather, hands and fingers are the means of togetherness, producing a sociality which can function in the way it does precisely because of the capacity of the fingers to flex along their length. In what medieval rhetoric knew as manuduction, it allows us to both guide and be guided in the conduct of life. The figures depicted by Henri Matisse in his celebrated painting, The Dance, which I've shown here, are linked thus in a chain of manuduction. Each is led with one hand and leads with the other. As Matisse recognized, the human figure not only has mass and volume, but is also a bundle of lines running along the arms and legs. And while the dancer's legs deliver the driving force, it's through their arms and hands knotted at the fingers that the momentum is imparted from one figure to the next. Yet, as you can see from the outstretched fingers of the figures in the foreground, here, the circuit is never quite closed, but always on the brink of closure, as the fingers of the leading figure reach out for those of the trailing figure that forever escape them. And so long as they escape, the whirligig continues. It's as though the lines of the fingers, far from ending abruptly at their tips, extended into a virtual space of possible but ever unrealized connection. Now, nowadays, many of the things we used to do by hand have been transferred to machines. At the core of technology As the historian Carl Mitchum once put it, at the core of technology, there seems to be a desire to transform the heuristics of technique into algorithms of practice. By this he means that rules of thumb that once guided skilled practitioners in their dexterous manipulations are converted into objective rules of operational functioning, that is, into formal algorithms, which can then be incorporated into machines designed to do the same jobs, only more efficiently. The historian of techniques, François Sigaud, argues along much the same lines. The entire history of techniques, Sigaud writes, may be interpreted as a constantly renewed attempt to build skills into machines by means of algorithms. So what then happens to the fingers? Even André Leroi-Gourhan, in his classic Gesture and Speech, Le Geste et la Parole, admitted that while the substitution of automatic machines for manual operations might represent an important social advance, not having to think with one's fingers nevertheless amounts to the loss of some essential part of our common humanity. There is a real sense, Leroi-Gourhan thought, in which a hand whose fingers have nothing to do save tap a key or flick a switch has not so much progressed as regressed. And this regression of the hand amounts to a kind of operational contraction, from the hand as a whole down to its fingertips. Hands with flexible fingers can hold and carry, but fingertips cannot, or not at least without calling a thumb to their aid. Does a hand then that has contracted to the fingertips lose its capacity to feel? Well, not necessarily, as I know from my own experience of playing the cello. This involves a great deal of finger work, exclusively for the left hand. And I am in no doubt that I feel through the tips of my fingers when I stop the strings on the fingerboard. Yet perhaps paradoxically, this string stopping is actually a movement that carries on. The movement, known as vibrato, is a prolonged quivering of the finger against the resistance of the board, which gives the sound itself a certain pulse. And to the listener, it comes across as full of feeling. To play without vibrato, by contrast, is to produce a sound that is eerily insentient, as though one had entered a world of dead souls in which no life is possible. In short, the feeling lies in the fact that the movement that brings the finger into contact with the fingerboard, with the string in between, is continued beyond the point of impact. It persists over time in a kind of correspondence, and this makes all the difference. The same is true of any other task that involves bringing the tip of your finger into contact with a surface. The pianist, for example, in playing a delicate melody, doesn't just tap the keys with her fingertips, she strokes them. The tip is supersensitive, but only because it continues to move beyond that moment of first contact, gliding over the surface. Only then does touch give way to feeling. But perhaps there's no better example of the regression of the hand than the substitution of the typewriter for writing by hand. With handwriting, flexible fingers hold a pen, which serves as a transducer, carrying over the finger's fine-tuned oscillatory movements without interruption into a wiggly trace on the page. Every little movement shows, even those that were unintended. But with the typewriter, the work of the fingers, now concentrated to their tips, consists only in tapping the keys. Here, the causal link between the manual micro-gesture and the material trace is broken. The marks that appear on the surface no longer bear any relation to the bodily movements involved in producing them. As the philosopher Martin Heidegger put it in one of his more famous diatribes against the technologizing of everything, the typewriter tears writing from the essential realm of the hand. And for Heidegger, the hand is the very cradle of our humanity. It holds our humanity, he thought, as it holds a pen. Yet modern man, observes Heidegger, with scarcely disguised revulsion, writes with a typewriter. And he put the with inside scare quotes to indicate that typing is not really writing with at all. It is merely the mechanical transcription of words onto paper. And what is lost in the transcription is the hapticality of the hand itself in immediate contact with the paper surface. The typescript, according to Heidegger, is inhuman because the words spelled out on the page are bereft of movement and feeling. But the situation in reality may be a little more complicated. To be sure, tapping on a keyboard is more percussive than descriptive. As a gesture, it comes to a point rather than drawing out a line. Nevertheless, as every pianist knows, the force of percussion can vary, producing sounds from soft to loud. With a manual typewriter, the letters appearing on the page, struck through an inked ribbon, can likewise vary from faint and barely legible to a deep black. At the extreme, even the edges of the letters can seem blurred, as if the letters themselves were quivering, and their loops can be smudged with the traces of ink from the ribbon. This is a little thing I made as a joke using a very old, beaten up manual typewriter, and you can see these different letter A's. Some are very black, some are not, some are smudged, some are not, in both capitals and lowercase. So you can tell something of the typist's mood from the intensity of her letters, just as you can tell the pianist's from the force with which she strikes the keys, or mine from the way I stop the strings of my cello. But with the advent of the electric typewriter, even this residual scope for expression was wiped out. While the type ball, which replaced the type bar of manual models, allows you to choose from a range of fonts, the responsivity of the keys is eliminated by the operating mechanism. Still, you still need paper and an ink ribbon. It was the development of the electronic monitor that finally put paid to these. With the printing function offloaded to a separate device, one can now write without materially marking any surface at all. And the result is to evacuate from our concept of writing any reference to paper and ink. As the page has taken second place to the screen, all traces of hapticality have disappeared. And with this, Heidegger's prognosis seems finally to be borne out. Fingertips now have a very different job to do. Let me give you an example which comes from my observations during a recent visit to the Leonardo da Vinci exhibition museum, the Leonardo da Vinci Museum in Rome. On my way around the exhibits, I was intrigued to observe a fellow visitor, absorbed in the perusal of a glass-fronted screen. On it were displayed digital images from Leonardo's many sketchbooks. Here is one of them. By tapping the glass with her finger, she could enlarge any selected area of the display, and by swiping it, she could turn from one page to the next. Observing her fingers at work, I couldn't help wondering how it would compare with the fingerwork of Leonardo himself, as he wrote and sketched in his minuscule hand with metal point stylus on paper. Let us set aside the question of virtuosity. Our museum visitor, we may presume, was no genius. At issue is rather the difference between the way of relating to surface I have called haptic and one that would be better called optical. Leonardo was manifestly possessed of a haptic vision that never left the page as it wriggled over the surface, transitioning without any sense of interruption between writing and drawing. Our visitor, to the contrary, at home in the digital environment, was possessed of an optical touch, which could find no grip on the smooth and homogeneous surface of the screen. For her, the finger was the servant of an eye that sees, rather than the eye, the service of a finger that feels. An optical touch, like optical vision, does not converge or linger on the surface of contact, where finger meets material, but cuts directly through, as through a window. There's a rather messy diagram here that I've drawn, but I'm contrasting the haptic touch or vision, where material and sense converge here, where surfaces meet in what I've called the zone of hapticality, and an optical touch or vision that cuts straight through a material interface, like looking through a pane of glass. So tapping on a digital keyboard or gazing at a screen, we experience the surface of the pad or screen as an interface, mediating an informatic exchange that cuts through from one side to the other. This is a tap that touches but does not feel, and a gaze that sees but does not observe. Here, touch and vision, as in a communications network, connect fixed points at a distance, rather than joining with the movement of things in their conformation. This difference between a haptic perception that lingers on the surface, as here, and an optical perception that cuts through it, as here, is evident not only in the practices of writing, but also in those of reading. Medieval scholars who in writing would inscribe parchment with pen and ink would also read with their fingers as well as their eyes by following the letter line. And they would listen as well, murmuring the corresponding sounds as they traced the letters with the fingers, so that the words, now heard rather than seen, would fall out from their voice. To read in this way was to inhabit the page, much as the wayfarer inhabits the terrain. And that this would have been obvious to people of the time is evident from the derivation of the word page from the Latin pagus, meaning a region of the inhabited countryside with its farms and fields, from which we also get the French paysan, meaning peasant, and paysage, meaning landscape. But the one thing the inhabitant cannot do is leapfrog from place to place. The only way is to make the journey. How different this is for the readers of today. For them, it is as though the page had vanished. The reader's attention, far from being caught in a web of lines that they are destined to follow, cuts straight through, as through a pane, sweeping up the letters it finds on the other side like crumbs from a tablecloth, and reassembling them into words and sentences. Reading has become a practice of algebra in its original sense, from Arabic, of the reunion of broken parts. And an attention thus divorced from the surface, like a spaceship from planet Earth, can dart about from point to point unhindered, alighting now here, now there. We're all too familiar with this scattergun approach to reading. It is what we do when we read on screen. For on the screen, there is no surface on which to find purchase, no letter line to follow. No wonder the operating system I use, alongside millions of others, is called Windows. In the eyes of our medieval forebears, to call this reading would be as absurd as supposing that you can walk without any ground to walk on. We have indeed forgotten what it means to truly inhabit the page, and our theories of reading reflect this. Let me sum up so far. With the rise of digital technology, just as numbers have been dissociated from things and turned into data for algorithmic processing, so too the work of the hand has been removed to the tips of the fingers. These fingertips, however, do not feel, but rather mediate the transmission of information in a virtual world of machinic intelligence, having no purchase in the real world of forces and materials. They cannot feel its surface textures, nor can they intertwine with one another, curl around things, pinch, grasp, hold, or carry. For millennia, human beings have used their fingers in skilled manual operations, ranging from handwriting, sewing and weaving, to bread making and playing musical instruments. Today, as digital technology increasingly invades the theatres of everyday life, we are close to losing these skills of fingerwork. Turning our backs on tradition, rather than relaying the skills of our predecessors, puts practices that have been sustained for millennia at risk of disappearing within a generation. Many are already lost or sustained only within narrow circles of hobbyists or academic specialists. What then will become of our descendants centuries from now, assuming that our kind has not already gone extinct? Although, of course, it is hard to know what kinds of lives they may be living, I think we may be certain, fairly certain, of three things. First, these people of the future, let us say 300 years from now, these people will still need to eat. And for this, they will have to labor on the earth and under the sky to grow their food, albeit under climatic conditions markedly different from those we encounter today. Moreover, as an ever-increasing proportion of the world's human population lives in cities, it is likely that for our descendants, cities will have become centers of food production as well as habitation. Climatic changes and the disuse of fossil fuels will have made it impossible to move food supplies across the globe from rural regions of production to urban centers of consumption, as happens today. By then, agriculture and urban planning will have merged into a single design discipline, tasked with creating environments for life. at high densities. Second, these humans to come will still be endowed, as we are, with organs of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, with mouths, lips, and vocal cords, with a full complement of fingers and toes, and with a nervous system that extends throughout the body and possibly beyond. In other words, they will have bodies much like ours, capable of looking and feeling where they are going, of responding with sensitivity and precision to variations in environmental conditions, of working with the hands and walking on 2 feet, and of communicating by speech and gesture. They will be social beings, as we are, but also beings whose lives are rooted in the places they collectively inhabit and the lands they know. But third, the technology that has come to define our present era will have long since imploded, along with all that depends on it: telecommunications, the internet, artificial intelligence, and robotics. For this technology, in order to function, will have placed demands on the Earth and its inhabitants that turned out to be simply unsustainable. These included the enslavement of large numbers of people in often appalling conditions, to the extraction of the rare and highly toxic heavy metals required for digital operations, and the expenditure of vast quantities of energy used to fuel the supercomputers and blast into space the thousands of satellites needed to keep the whole system running. Even though we of the present cannot tell exactly how the digital era will implode, whether gradually or in one catastrophic event, we can be confident that it will do so eventually. When this will happen is anyone's guess, though I'm inclined to apply the 150-year rule. Coal's heyday, the heyday of coal, lasted from the 1810s to the 1960s. The age of oil and gas began in the 1910s and will last perhaps until the 2060s. On that score, the digital era, starting in the 1980s, has until the 2130s. Centuries on then, our descendants will find themselves depending on all the bodily senses and skills at their disposal to eke out a livelihood at high concentrations on an earth and under heavens that, thanks to the designs of the present, have become veritable junkyards of defunct devices. Yet, even as we turn our backs on past generations, and even with the story we tell ourselves of the Anthropocene, we turn our backs on history itself, we continue to envisage a post-historic future that turns this reality back to front. In this vision, it is bodily organs of action and perception that are destined for extinction, while digital technology is miraculously self-sustaining. Instead of a human future that is post-digital, we cling to the idea of a digital future that is post-human. In this imagined future, the so-called smart cities, far from being centers of food production, will have become hubs of creativity whose inhabitants, already offloaded into their devices, will have lost all connection with the earth. They could just as well be floating offshore on artificial islands, in space, or even on other planets. If citizens still have eyes, ears, and other organs of sense, these will have been reduced to portals, mediating a flow of information that connects them into a vast but entirely disembodied and placeless neural network. In this fully digitized world, the Fingers and toes, the original digits of the human body, will have become mere appendages, relics of an evolutionary past now irrevocably superseded. And what passes for social life will no longer have anything to do with holding on to one another. It will simply be a function of network connectivity. Now, this vision may seem far-fetched, but it is already impacting on the designs of the present. And for an example, we have only to return to the theme of writing, which I've already explored. We have seen how literate people around the world have picked up lines from the past and carried them on in gestures that have traveled from hand to hand through a process of copying involving both imitation and emulation over countless generations. Yet today, as we tap our words in a standardized typeface on digital keyboards, while directing our gaze at the screen on which they are projected, writing, in the sense of inscribing a line in a surface, has become a thing of the past. Many adults are losing skills of handwriting diligently learned in childhood, while for a new generation raised on keypads, these skills are already deemed obsolete. The loss is incalculable. Banishing the expressive force of gesture and grace is equivalent in writing to silencing the expressive power of the voice in speech. A society without handwriting would be like one without song, in which words are but the liquid currency of an information economy. So after writing, will speech be the next victim of digitization? Will the affective powers of the voice be expelled from speaking, just as the keypad and screen have expelled those of the hand from writing? And will digital synthesizers be left to assemble messages from standardized speech sounds? Speaking and writing are precious gifts, all the more so when digital technology self-destructs, as it inevitably will. And the same goes for all those skills of livelihood on which the continued survival of humans to come will ultimately depend. So let me suggest just one more example by inviting you to compare two things. On the one hand, a laptop computer, on the other, a loaf of bread. They weigh about the same, and although of rather different shape, one rather flat, the other lumpy, they are of roughly similar volume. Both are products of human artifice and draw for their manufacture on a range of materials and techniques. Both call for fingerwork, and both, for most of us today, are things which we cannot do without. And yet, loaves of bread have been baked for at least 8,000 years, whereas the laptop computer has been with us for no more than 40 years. So which of these two things, loaf or laptop, will outlast the other? Now, advocates of digital post-humanism would doubtless put their money on the computer. It's time to turn our back on the loaf, they would say, including the laborious business of preparing the soil, growing and harvesting the crop, milling and baking. Why? The digital post-human may not even need to eat. For surely, technology will finally solve the problem of life and death, relieving us from the drudgery of having to inhabit aging and increasingly decrepit bodies. But post-digital humanism, by contrast, would side with the loaf. It has been with us already for 8 millennia, and there's no reason in principle why it should not endure for another 8. But for reasons already outlined, the days of the laptop are numbered, even if the toxic residues from discarded devices may continue to stain the earth for thousands of years. Neither the loaf nor the laptop, of course, exists in isolation. Both are embedded in far-flung webs of relations. But the principles on which these relations are constructed are diametrically opposed to one another. For the loaf, they are founded in an immediate, sensuous bodily involvement with place and materials, of feet with soil, and hands and fingers with dough, as well as in the collaboration and commensality of working and eating together. Bread isn't only a glutinous web of organic fibers. It is also a web of human beings in community. For the laptop, by contrast, it is a web that, while celebrating connectivity, is almost entirely disconnected from bodily sensibilities, as well as from place and community. Much of it is invisible and insensible, extending around the globe in an estimated 1 million miles of fiber optic cable and the thousands of communications satellites already orbiting the planet. But most fundamentally of all, the loaf and the laptop embody different kinds of time. The temporality of bread making is bound up with the agricultural cycle, itself tied to the annual cycle of the seasons and to the vagaries of weather. This is a time that carries on without in any way advancing. The loaves we bake today, just like the letters we handwrite, may be a bit different, but are no advance on those baked or written 8,000 years ago. And incidentally, they can be traced to the same source in ancient Sumeria. The laptop, by contrast, is absolutely tied to linear chronological time. It is this that allows users, randomly distributed over the surface of the globe, to achieve virtual simultaneity. A minute, an hour, a day are precisely the same, whatever the place, weather, or season. Perhaps then we might contrast bread time or handwriting time with laptop time. I'd like to link this contrast to the ways we think of generations and their passage. We modern people, still basking in the afterglow of the Enlightenment, are addicted to the idea of progress. Armed with this idea, we are convinced that each generation is destined to supplant its predecessors, projecting its own allegedly superior vision for the future over those that went before. Generation thus follows generation as a series of layers, alternately covering and covered. For people who think like this, only if the new supplants the old, thrusting it back into the past, never to resurface, only then can we be confident that progress is being made. Here, novelty is the name of the game, for without innovation there is no progress, and without progress, no future. The laptop, in this sense, belongs to a history of progress. But the loaf and handwriting do not. Novelty or innovation is one thing, however, renewal or rejuvenation quite another. And there is renewal only in following old ways, not turning our backs on previous generations, but following in their footsteps. In this view, the ancestors are always before us. They are our future, while we come after. Generations then do not so much supplant each other as carry on, twisting around each other, rather like the fibers of a rope. In the rope, each fiber is only so long, but by introducing new fibers as fast as old ones give out, the rope can go on winding indefinitely. And it's the same with lives. So my plea, in conclusion, is for a new humanism, a post-digital humanism, which, as in the activities of handwriting and bread making, is dedicated not to the supplanting of generations, but to the renewal of life. Instead of turning fingers into the robotic extensions of an artificial intelligence, let us return numbers to where they belong, in the zone of hapticality. And instead of treating fingertips as discrete values, let us restore them to the hand. As the painter Vasily Kandinsky put it in his essay, Point and Line to Plane, the finger grows out of the hand exactly as a twig has to grow out of the branch. And here, this is just a diagram, a figure from Kandinsky's book, where he talks about this. So for Kandinsky, the finger is joined to the hand as the twig to the branch by a relationship that is internal rather than external, by growth rather than attachment. And we surely owe it to the generations that will follow ours to grow the skills of numeracy and fingerwork that served our ancestors for so long. For far into the future, people will still need them, just as they did in the past. To reunite hand and mind in the practices of fingerwork is not just a nostalgic yearning for a lost childhood. It is an essential investment for humans to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. I'm sure everybody is clapping. So yeah, we are meant to do the Q&A based on questions that our participants send into the form. But we have only two questions, one of Tati and one of me. So maybe we can open the mic, because I'm sure you all might have questions, but maybe you couldn't write them. So we open the mic if you have any questions. If not, we can do ours.
I have a question.
Christian?
Christian.
Yes, Christian?
Tim, I'm actually, as Camila was saying, I was clapping here in my room. I'm in New Zealand, it's like 5 in the morning. So it's just like, what a day, what a way to start our day. So thank you very much. I'm researching as well technology, particularly in the classroom. And one of the things that I discussed with Camila many times is like, one of the things that I couldn't find was the body. It was like the processes were there, but the body wasn't there. So I don't know if it's a particular question about that, but my question is, what is the way forward? I know it was quite illuminating, that thing that you were saying about this is eventually going to come to an end. But in the meantime, for example, in the field of education, that presents so much challenges, because technology, as you are saying, has become that portal into the world. The only way that in most classrooms students have to experience the world is through these digital portals. And the experience of the world that they are gaining is actually very different from us, particularly from the social.
And I this is true, and I don't know how to answer it. I mean, for one thing, I really don't understand or I certainly don't know, or I'm out of touch with the experience of kids who've been brought up as digital natives. I mean, it's almost impossible to think myself into their way of being. It's so different, and I think that's the case for most people of my generation. They find it very, very difficult, and particularly people like me who never felt comfortable in the digital world in the first place. But I do get annoyed with pundits who tell us that, you know, this is the way the world is going, and you better just get used to it, as though these pundits, have decided for themselves what the future is going to be and are imposing it on everybody else. Usually they're in the pay of big tech companies who obviously just want to make shed loads of money, and that's really where the problem lies, I think. And I honestly don't know how to break this dependency on the screen, on the iPhone, on the computer. I don't know how to do it, but I'm convinced in my own mind that it has to be done. And it's one of the most urgent tasks in contemporary education. I really don't know how to do it. But unless we start trying, unless we say, look, this is something that has to be done, rather than just saying, no, there's nothing we can do about it, this is the way things are going, we, I think, betray the generations that will come after us. We have some sort of responsibility to do what we can to bring this headlong process of digitization to a close, because it's going to come to an end anyway. And we have no idea how, but it will. I mean, just as though I'm quite absolutely sure that I'm going to die, but I have no idea how or when it's going to happen. I'm absolutely sure that digitization is going to come to an end, but we don't know how, when, or exactly what the course of it will be. But the only responsible thing, I think, is to think about what a world will be like afterwards.
Thank you. I have a question. It's regarding attention. At some point in your talk regarding manual practices, you said attention converges on the contact zone where surfaces meet. So considering the distinction you make between haptic perception and optical perception, how do you see the role that attention plays in each of them? So, or what do you think are the consequences in attentional terms of this transition from haptic to optical perception?
Well, first of all, I think the focus on attention is really crucial, and it's something that's that is appearing all over the place in scholarship. There's an enormous upsurge, I think, of interest in attentionality, rather than previously it was all focusing on intentionality, and I think this is important. But also attention can mean different things, and so in the shift from the haptic to the optical, there's also a shift in the meaning of attention. There's a sort of attention which is like when you watch and listen. It means you're coupling your own perception to a process that is going on. You watch a football match, you're watching the play, it's all evolving on the pitch. You're listening to a piece of music, it's unfolding there as the orchestra is playing. And so in doing that, in watching and listening, you're actually harnessing the movement of your own perception to whatever is going on in the world that is of interest to you. But there's another sense of attention, which is more like focusing in on a target, where it has a definite end point. Sometimes you get the phrase "stop, pay attention," which means that and actually to do this focusing, instead of moving with things, you actually have to stop moving and home in on a fixed point. And often in educational contexts, when the pupil is told to stop fooling about and pay attention, it means that they should be be staring at something on the blackboard or whatever it is they're supposed to be doing, rather than joining in the movement of things. So there's, if you will, there's a kind of a haptic attention, but there's also an optical sense of attention, which is like directing. It's like it's like shooting an arrow at a target. It's centripetal, heading towards a center. So I think it's about how we move between these different senses of what attention actually is.
Thank you. The mic is open for more questions. David? David, you? Oh, first
yes.
David and then.
Thank you, Tim, ever so much for the big picture that you've laid out before us. It really is awe-inspiring. I have three small questions. One, very much in line with your account, Roger Kneebone, who is a surgeon, laments the fact that it's difficult to teach contemporary students surgery because they're all thumbs. They don't know how to wield a scalpel because the only digits they use are their thumbs when they are typing and so forth. And so this is a further example of just the kind of unskilling that you're describing. But another example I'd like to put on the table is a story I heard of a little girl with a magazine doing this to the magazine. So she had observed her parents with a screen, enlarging an image. And so she was here, trying to use that same technique on a screen, and it didn't work. But my question from that is there another direction as well? You've traced an evolutionary trajectory, but is there any way in which these kinds of gestures, the swipe and so forth, might reverse course and actually enlarge possibilities? Like, why shouldn't a magazine be expandable in that way? And my third very, very small question again is that I recall an elderly professor of architecture lamenting the fact, similar to Kneebone, that no longer are architecture students made to construct balsam models, which involves using an X-Acto knife and actually creating a model that is three-dimensional. Now, there are risks to having students wielding knives. They can cut themselves and all kinds of lacerations result. But he felt that it was so much more important that they have that experience than everything being CAD, everything being computer-assisted design, precisely because how can one properly have a sense of volume, from a screen? However manipulable the dimensions on the screen might be, they're still not going to give you that sense of volume. But I wondered where volume enters in with your account of lines. It seems to me that lines, do they have volume in the same way? So please forgive me. There are 1,000 more questions I'd love to put, but thank you so much for your presentation.
Okay, thanks, David. There are three answers. First on Roger Kneebone, I know him well. He's a great guy, and his book on the expert is terrific. I'm sure you're referring to it, and it's a really interesting story what you told about a kid who's learnt a technique of using the thumbs on the iPhone, then trying to use it for something else. And I think the question that I mean, I agree with Roger on most things, and particularly about what he has to say about problems with teaching surgery, which of course I know nothing about, but from his experience. And one of the wonderful things that Roger Kneebone, was to bring together people from all sorts of walks of life who, in the practice of their trade or their profession, have to work with threads of one sort and another, and tie knots and things. So he brought together a surgeon, a puppeteer who works with marionettes, a fisherman who has to mend their nets, and I can't remember who else, but people who would never come to think of bringing together normally, and finding that they had very similar experiences of manipulating lines and threads, often when you have to do it like tie a knot with one hand, that kind of thing. It's perfectly possible that a movement like a swipe could that one could take movements that have developed in the context of digital technology and find ways in which they could enhance possibilities. But I think the difference is this, that when you I noticed, I did this experiment myself this morning just to check, that I put my finger, just placed my finger down, just like that, on lots of different surfaces, just putting it like that straight down. And I could tell, okay, I've hit a surface, but I simply, if I closed my eyes, couldn't tell one surface from another. But if I put my finger down and then just swiped it a little bit, then I could immediately say what surface it was I touched, even if my eyes were closed. So what's crucial is that movement. But if you swipe on the phone, I can't feel anything at all, because I suppose it's part of the way these things work, that the surface of this phone has to be as homogeneous as it is technically possible to be, so that you actually feel nothing. So for the swipe to actually enlarge the realm of human possibility, that's fine, but we have then to bring it back into contact with surfaces that actually have texture. The third point, I absolutely agree with your colleague, architectural colleague, who says that it's crucial for architects to learn how to build models and also how to draw. Otherwise, they don't get any kind of sense of volume. And I think also, when you go around in a city, it's almost you can tell which buildings have been designed on CAD and which haven't, simply by looking at the buildings. And that, I think, tells you something. Where does volume enter into it? Maybe I could refer back to that painting of Matisse I showed you, the one about the dance, because Matisse's figures are very voluminous. They're kind of almost chunky, although they're tremendously dynamic. And I think what he manages to do, but I like that painting so much, is that he combines that sense of real mass, real volume. These are figures could be quite heavy and big, with an incredible sense of movement. And that, for me, gives the idea that you can think of volumes as masses through which these lines of force sort of go penetrate. Or just to give another example, which I've written about, think about a dry stone wall. It's made out of big chunks of stone, very heavy, and each of those stones certainly has a certain volume. But if you want to look at how it is that the wall stands up, then each stone because they're irregular, will sit at a minimum of 3 points on the stone below. You could draw a kind of force diagram and see there how the whole thing stands up. So, if you will, the volume gives us mass, but the lines give us integrity or coherence or something like that. That's my answer.
Thank you. So we have time for maybe one or two, maybe one last question. I think who had already Esteban or Abhishek? The hands, Abhishek?
I think Andre raised the hand first. So if there is one, then maybe Andre can ask. I think Andre raised the hand first.
Okay.
Or if you allow me, then I can ask.
You can, Andre? Okay, so Abhishek, you can go.
Okay. Okay. So thank you, Professor. So my question is on policy side, and with when you see the digitization and everything what you said and inevitability of this happening, so what is the role of the state you see? So I was listening to a podcast yesterday where they are talking about in US, in other places where they are trying to restrict the use of phones, mobile phones in schools. So what is the role of state there? If you could, say something on that.
That's a terribly difficult question. I mean, here in the UK, we're having this, I'm sure in most countries, we're having this public debate that is going on, and the various experiments being applied in banning phones from schools. There's no state level policy, but schools are adopting their own policies sometimes and seeing how they work. And even parents are trying to come up with policies for their own children, or to try and promote them in the schools that their children attend. And it's really, really politically tricky, because you immediately fall into the argument between those who would like the state to adopt a rather almost paternalistic role in this, and lay down the rules as to what to do, and the libertarians who argue that the state should do no such thing, that this is a matter between parents and their children and individual schools, and it's none of the state's business to intervene. And I myself don't really know what the best solution is. I think sort of common sense answer that the best solution in the immediate term is simply to have a sensible, public, grown-up conversation about the whole matter, which is not caught up in identity politics or wokery or any of the other nonsense that is hijacking our political system at the moment. Maybe the answer, I'll be even more general, because I think this is the last thing. But I think that what is tearing our societies apart at the moment is the fact that democracy and education have become detached from one another. As I say, we have a mainstream view of education which is linked to meritocracy, to the idea that one simply getting people to rise to the top. And against that, we have an idea of democracy, which as the will of the people. And so the people who claim to be Democrats blame education for creating the very inequalities that they're railing against. So democracy. So we have this what seems like we found that with in the UK with the Brexit debate. I'm sure it occurs in different forms, but there seems to be a polarization between education, which is supposed to favor the liberal elite, and democracy, which is supposed to be to support populism. And it seems to me this is very, very unfortunate. And what we have to do, and the first priority, is to find a way of bringing democracy and education together again. And that means, in my understanding, changing the way we think about both education and democracy in very fundamental ways. And what will bring them together is the idea that both education and democracy are really a kind of public conversation, a conversation that goes on between generations, a conversation in which young and old would participate on equal terms. That's what education should be about, and it's also what democracy should be about. And if we had that conversation, crucially involving people of all generations, not segmented into different things, so the conversation is just among this generation or that, then I think maybe we could begin to arrive at some sort of understanding as to how to move forward with an issue like this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a very, very inspiring talk. I'm very grateful, Tim, for your disponibility, and to all of you for your presence and participation. And this is a conversation that will carry on. It's an ongoing conversation. So next month, we have our next seminar. It will be the 4th of June. And it's going to be Dani Lima, a Brazilian choreographer, who will be doing the seminar on cellular presence. So we hope to have you here with us next month. And yeah, thank you very much, Professor Ingold, and to all of you for your presence. And yeah, see you next month.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it a lot. And now I can go and have a drink. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice to see you all. Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Chao, gracias. Chao. Ya, apague, apague, apague.